This conference is called Creating Loving Relationships. And as many of you know, sometimes when the teenage years come along, loving relationships go out the window. Not always, but sometimes. And I do a lot of work with parents of teenagers. I run groups of parents of teenagers. And I have to tell you that many, many families find this adolescent period difficult, stressful, challenging. And so when I saw the title, Creating Loving Relationships, I thought, well, my contribution is really about looking at a stage where actually it's quite difficult to keep those loving relationships going, and all the things that Suzanne has talked about, that sense of attachment, that sense of really being in touch with your son or daughter is not as easy as it was when they were much younger. But the other thing that Suzanne talked a lot about was the brain. And one of the things I've been very, very struck with over the last perhaps year, 2 years, is how often people are asking me, well, what's all this stuff about the adolescent brain? This is all very interesting, there's lots of stuff in the press and so on. You know, how can we incorporate this into our practice? Does it matter? Should we be changing things? And so I thought today, if you don't mind, I'm going to do something I haven't done before, which is really to try and explore what the impact of this new evidence, new knowledge is for both parents and practitioners. I think it's a really important question because we read about it, we know that there are new bits of scientific evidence coming out, but how does that impact on each of us? How does it impact on practitioners? And how does it impact on the work that we do with parents? And I want to talk a little bit about this. I want to talk a bit about the brain and what we know about the adolescent brain. Then I'm going to give you an example of a local authority in England, Hertfordshire, which has actually developed a program called My Teen Brain for practitioners and for parents. And then I want to end up really just thinking about how this evidence can be used. Okay, so very briefly, I'm conscious of time. So what do we know about the adolescent brain? Well, first of all, it's a time of major change. Suzanne's talked about the early years. We know that in the early years, there's the biggest development in the human brain occurs. But the time of the next greatest change, and that's throughout the life cycle, is the teenage years. So it's a time of huge change, adaptation, and development. We know that there are two particular sites in the brain which undergo the greatest change, and I'll show you a picture in a minute. And we know that the development, the maturation that's occurring during these years doesn't occur at the same pace for different parts of the brain. So in other words, there's lots of different changes going on, but they're not necessarily in sync. And the other very interesting thing, which I don't think anyone knew really before scanning came along, before the technology came along, is that actually the changes in the brain continue right through adolescence to the early 20s. I think most people thought that puberty was the time when the change occurred. Now we know that this change goes on for quite a long time. So it's a time, and I suppose the other very important thing is that people often think of it as a time of deficit. In other words, it's a time when the brain isn't functioning very well, when the teenager is doing all sorts of ridiculous things, misbehaving and so on. But the key thing is that it's both a time of new skills developing and of some deficits, and that's the really important thing. I'm going to just show you very briefly some pictures. You'll have to excuse the rather poor quality. But the reason I'm showing you this is that there are the two sides which really change. So the first one is the purple, that's the prefrontal cortex, the front bit in here. And this is the part that's really to do with thinking, reasoning, problem solving, intellectual development, okay? And the second bit is what's called the amygdala, which is the sort of red and yellow bit there. And that's to do with sensation, arousal, emotion regulation. And these are the two particular sites that scanning technology has shown us change most. And what, of course, is interesting to everyone is does the problem solving and the thinking and the ability to plan and do those sorts of intellectual things keep pace with the demands of the sensation and arousal and emotion center, okay? Now the other thing I wanted to show you was it's not brilliant, but this is a picture that you would get from scanning. This is from the top of the head. And the reason I'm showing you is because it just shows, in a way, what we do, what we can see, but also the limitations. So what scanning does is it simply shows you the different parts of the brain and how active they are. So scanning detects, essentially, it's detecting blood flow by looking at the amount of oxygen in the different parts of the brain, okay? So it's brilliant, but it's very limited. It doesn't tell you what the person is thinking. You know, it shows you what bits of the brain are active under different circumstances, but it doesn't tell you everything. And this is the third thing. Now, you've all heard about the grey matter. You know, people talk about our little grey cells, and losing our grey cells and all that sort of thing, okay? So this is just showing you that the grey matter is all around the edge of the brain. And this is really where most of the billions, and they are literally billions, of nerve cells are. The bit in the middle is where this is generalization, it's not quite like this, but broadly this is where the connections, the nerve fibers are. So really I just wanted to show you, give you a sense of what we do know. Okay, the limitations, I've just said. So the technology of scanning is still evolving and developing. So really, we only started really, scanning was developed over a number of years, but the sort of scanning that we use for looking at the brain, particularly this functional magnetic resonance imaging, it can only tell us so much. And we've really only been gathering evidence for about 15 years. Scanning is expensive. I don't know how many of you have ever had a scan, brain scan, but it's expensive and it's not terribly pleasant because quite a lot of noise. You have a helmet around your head, quite a lot of noise. It's expensive, and so we're still using quite small samples. We can't scan thousands of people, and that's partly why actually we're learning new things all the time. Scanning, as I've said, only gives us a picture of the blood flow. Now, hormones, it's not just the architecture or the structure of the brain. The other thing, of course, is happening is that there are dozens of different hormones, and those hormones affect the brain. We all know about testosterone and progesterone. But there are two other particularly important hormones. One is dopamine. You've probably heard of dopamine. And one of the things about adolescence is that dopamine levels are low. And so teenagers are keen to get what's called a dopamine hit, which is what you get when you get a reward. When you have a good feeling, dopamine goes up. And if dopamine levels are low, young people are looking for higher levels of dopamine. That's one very important thing. And the other thing is melatonin, the sleep hormone. This is really important. I don't know how many of you know this, but melatonin is the hormone which makes us sleepy at night. And one of the things that's come out of this research is the finding that the melatonin levels don't work quite the same way in adolescence as they do in adulthood. And what happens in adolescence is that melatonin levels rise more slowly. The body clock is slightly different. So they rise more slowly at night, and that impact on young people means that it's more difficult to go to sleep. And this is really, really important. So when we think that our teenagers are being difficult or just don't want to do what we want them to do or whatever, and don't want to go to bed at night, actually there is a genuine physiological reason for this. And this is absolutely critical because we know that teenagers need a good night's sleep. Low levels of sleep deficit lead to poor learning, and it leads to behavior problems. So sleep is incredibly important. It's very interesting that the Wellcome Trust, which is the biggest funder of medical research in the UK, has just recently put a huge amount of money into a whole series of studies about the adolescent brain. And one of them is to do with sleep. And what they've done is they've funded about 50 secondary schools to start later in the morning. Okay, and the reason for this is obviously, what people argue is if you get young people going to school and starting school at about 8:45 or whatever it is, it's actually like you and I going to work at 5:30 in the morning. So we wouldn't be functioning so well at 5:30 in the morning, would we? Welcome is funding schools to start later, but they're also funding some really interesting stuff, which is actually getting young people to learn more about developing good sleep patterns. And you can do an awful lot with young people, helping them to get into better sleep patterns. Okay, I can see the time, so I'm going to move on. One of the other things that people talk a lot about is the social brain, so it's really important to remember that, yes, there are some limitations. Young people are struggling with emotional regulation, with the hormones and so on, but also a whole lot of very positive things. Skills are developing, and these are the sorts of things, when we talk about the social brain, and I have to say there isn't one side, lots of different parts of the brain are playing a part here, but this is the sort of thing. Recognizing other people's emotions, developing empathy, working out how, if you meet someone for the first time, how do you work out if they're a goodie or a baddie? Those are the sorts of skills, and perspective taking, being able to understand other people. Those are the sorts of skills that young people are learning. So what are the conclusions? It's a time of huge change, and that, I'll come on to why that's so important. Such extensive change could not happen without major adaptation and major change to behavior. Two particular functions, as I've said, there are big individual differences. Not everyone is the same. Imagine we had 3 12-year-old boys standing here. It's perfectly possible that one would be very tall and would look very mature. One would just be starting puberty and one would still be a child. Okay? That's exactly what's happening in the brain. So some are developing early, some are developing moderate, and some are slow. Okay? There are major individual differences. I haven't talked about gender, about ethnicity. Those are really important. Don't have time to do that now, but we know there are big gender differences in brain development, just as there are with puberty. Girls start puberty 18 months, roughly, earlier than boys. So brain development is different. We know that girls have better language skills than boys. So all those things are reflected in brain development. But the other important thing is that the brain is only one factor. So the environment is key. Not, our brain is one part of what determines our behavior, but the environment is critical. Now, just a couple, I assume these PowerPoint slides are going to be available for everyone. So just a couple of things. I don't know how many of you know about TED Talks. Brilliant TED Talks. If you don't know about TED Talks, do explore them. Sarah Jane Blakemore, who's in London, she's got a great TED Talk on the mysterious workings of the adolescent brain. It's 10 minutes, just fascinating. And then the Wellcome Trust, just look up neuroscience and education. Okay, so now the next thing I want to tell you is the work that I'm doing for Hertfordshire. And this is interesting, it links with what Suzanne was saying. Hertfordshire started a program called My Baby's Brain about 3 years ago. And the idea was that they wanted to train all their early years workers, whether they were nursery nurses, health visitors, whoever it was, on attachment issues. So it's a brilliant program, and you can look it up. It's available for everyone, okay? They produce training courses, website, booklets, and film, and so on. Now, when this had been successful, they decided that perhaps they could do something similar for the adolescent brain. So My Teen Brain was what came next, and I've been involved in developing that. So we're about halfway through developing all these things. There is a website, there are booklets, we haven't done the film yet. We've trained approximately 250 practitioners, and we've got a waiting list of over 100 people wanting to do our course. The evaluations have been very, very positive. People have absolutely loved it. But what's interesting is that people come thinking that this is going to be the answer to all their practical work problems. So they come thinking, we're going to get some information, and this is completely changing our work with families, or with teenagers, or whatever. And I think, I hope I've explained to you, yes, we are learning quite a lot, but there's a lot we don't know. So people ask me, say, well, what do we know about, for example, the adolescent brain and autistic spectrum disorder, for example? Or how much, is aggressive behavior affected by brain development? Well, we're beginning to learn those sorts of things, but as I said before, the samples are still very small. So we're really in the middle of a very exciting journey. We don't know everything. And so one of the things that practitioners who come to these courses say, you know, well, it's been very, very interesting, but I would have liked to know more. Well, we're on a journey. We're still learning. Any of you are interested, there's the website. As I say, presumably the slides will be circulated. It's fascinating and it's available to anyone, and it's been a really, really great project. Okay, so one of the things we say to practitioners, I'll come on to parents in a minute, say to practitioners, okay, so, you know, you've really enjoyed it, there's been a great buzz, we've all had good discussions and so on. What sort of things, you know, we have a session, how do you going to embed this in practice? So here are some of the things that people say. I will be more understanding. I won't be so harsh in my judgments. I will try and listen more. There's a lot of stuff about listening and communication. I had no idea that the brain changed so much. I hope it will change, the knowledge will change my practice. And when I look at a teenager, I'll try not to look at the anger on the face, but think about what's happening in the brain. Okay? So, you know, yes, it's been good, but I think we've got a long way to go. Now, what about parents and carers? I think that one of the, well, there's lots of things really, but I think that when parents and carers look at the teenager and they see a very different person from the child that they've got to know, they see a person who doesn't want to talk to them, who certainly doesn't want to listen to their advice, who doesn't want to tell them things, and so on and so forth. They see it as somehow to do with them. They feel that they aren't as effective as parents. We know that self-confidence goes right down when the teenage years come along. They see themselves as somehow having failed. And it seems to me absolutely central to help parents understand that this is a stage, okay? And stage is a process. It's something that we all live through, and things will change, and it's not about you as a parent. Now, when I came here to Parenting Across Scotland, I think last year, I talked about a book that I've recently written, which is called Why Won't My Teenager Talk to Me? And in it, I've proposed a framework, which I call the stage framework. And this stage framework is partly underlining this fact that, and I think it's absolutely central for parents and carers, that this is something that is going to change, that is a process, and to some extent, of course, it is very much affected by the brain. It won't last forever. And in my stage framework, I called it stage for two reasons. One, because it is a stage, but also because each of the letters in stage stand for something which I think is central in parenting. So the S stands for significance, the fact that parents and carers, that adults are significant. Parents and carers feel that they're not, as I've said. They feel that young people want to talk to their friends, they don't want to talk to them, and so on. All the evidence shows that parents in adolescence are just as important, play just as important a role as parents of younger children, just a different role. T stands for two-way communication. Too often, when parents and young people are communicating, it is one way. Teenagers say, my parent either wants to know something or wants to tell me something, right? What sort of communication is that? It's one way. It's coming from me, the adult, to you, the teenager. It doesn't work with young people. Communication is two-way, it's a two-way street. A is for authority, authoritative parenting. G is for generation gap, because one of the things I think is so important is that parents judge young people's behaviour, whether it's good or bad, and they're using their own experience, their generation's experience, to make those judgments. But we know that growing up today is quite different. There are quite different pressures today. And so when we judge young people, which we don't want to judge young people, but we need to think about the context in which they're growing up today. And E, the E in stage, is to do with emotion. Because that, to me, is the central thing. The parents' emotions, anger, frustration, irritation, guilt, shame, all the things that you know as practitioners. But it's the teenagers' emotions as well that are very difficult to manage. So when you've got two people, the adult and the young person, both finding difficulty in managing their emotions, it's an explosive situation. Loving relationships go out the window. Okay, so this is a framework which I've got in here, and it's all those things are linked, for me, to brain development. So we're trying to link that together. I really think it can help parents and practitioners to understand, to really grasp that this is a process, and that the behaviour, whether you're a psychologist or a social worker or a carer, that the behaviour that's sometimes very difficult, and I know I've sat in innumerable rooms with upset, distressed, traumatised, tormented teenagers, that the behaviour that they're expressing is not about you. And maybe through our professional work, mostly, although actually I found myself having real difficulty managing my emotions. Sometimes I get frustrated, angry, irritated, and so on. But for parents, it's much harder. So understanding that the young person's behaviour is not directed at them is really critical. And that it is a process. It is a process that, if we can understand that process and know that it's not going to last forever, and that your very lovely child has turned into someone you really don't know how to manage, that's not going to last forever. So understanding that is critical. One of the things that has come out a lot in the Hertfordshire training is this issue of blaming my brain. There's a book called Blame My Brain by, I can't remember, not Nicola someone, I can't remember. Anyway, there's a book called Blame My Brain. Is there a danger that we say it's all the brain? And a lot of people, certainly in Hertfordshire, have asked that. So it's important to remember the brain is only one factor, as I've said. Parents play a key role. But also, understand, so much of the discourse, if I can use that word, is about, young people taking more risks. It's the brain underlies risk-taking and so on. But the thing is that it's both the skills are developing and some of these less adaptive things are part of this process. So understanding that we've got new skills developing, as well as sometimes when, I know the young person is very focused on themselves, egocentrism, very selfish behaviour, the sense that today is the only day. I'm sure any of you who have teenagers will know, something happens, you get a bad mark or something, the whole life is destroyed. Asking a young person, for example, to leave the phone outside the bedroom at night, the young person says, "You're ruining the whole of my life." It's that sort of thing that, those sorts of deficits. So we have to remember that two things are happening. The positive, the adaptive skills are developing at the same time as some of these limitations. So, it's a hugely exciting new area of research. I think it will have, and it is already having, profound effects on our understanding of young people and young people's development. But we've got a long way to go, so it's important to understand that. And I would really stress that this, just to help parents and practitioners understand something about this stage of development, understand how big the changes are in the brain. And if you and I had those changes going on, our behaviour would be affected. And just understanding that, because recognising that this is a particular stage of development. So I hope that's been a little exploration of what our understanding of the brain is, and I hope it's been useful to you. Thank you very much indeed.